It gets easier to tell stories with video every day, but there's a couple of hallmarks that we always look for in a good video. One is that we have good characters, so heroes or villains that we want to root against or for, and having a good story, journey, structure, arc for our characters to work through. We're going to talk about both of those things, but first we're going to go through some quick tips on video shooting just to make sure that you can have the best video that you can. First, make sure you're holding the camera correctly. So ideally you have a tripod that's going to keep your camera still. If you don't have a tripod or a stabilizer, then you need to start worrying about stabilizing yourself. So if you can, lean against something to help steady you. If you can't lean against something, then you want to make sure you're standing with your feet shoulder width apart and you're getting as good a balance as possible and keep the camera as close to you as possible. The next thing we're going to talk about is framing. So for example, if you're doing an interview, you want to make sure that the person you're filming, that the top of their head is pretty close to the top of the frame. If they're looking at the camera, you want to make sure that they are centered and looking into the lens. But if they're looking off camera, you want to make sure that they're off center and looking across the center of the lens. And in general, when you're filming anything else, you want to make sure that as a general rule of thumb, that your subject is basically looking across the center of the frame or moving toward the center of the frame. Generally, you want to avoid them looking off frame or walking off the frame. Now, there are times you would do that, but in general, make sure they're positioned toward the center of the frame. We also want to remember our angles. So if you are looking up at something, you're going to make it seem big, ominous, scary. If you're looking down at something, you're going to make it seem less important. You're going to make it seem diminished. And don't be afraid to change your height. So for example, if you're filming a dog and you're filming from the point of view of an adult human, that's going to be a pretty typical shot. It's not going to be very exciting. But if you can get down on the eye level of the dog, things start to look a little bit more interesting. Third, watch your light. You want the person on camera to be well lit. Cameras these days do a pretty good job of adjusting on their own, but it helps if you can have a better source of light than what is generally left in a room. If you don't have a light kit, natural light is generally going to be your best bet. If you can, you want to use a window if you're inside to act as your light source, so it'll give you natural light while still being inside. If you're filming outside, you generally want to be filming in close to sunrise or close to sunset. That way you're getting a nice warm light that isn't too much for the camera. And if you're stuck inside without a window, just pay attention to the lights that are in the room. If you can move around lamps to help adjust your lighting. And don't be afraid to turn on and off other ceiling lights to help adjust your lighting as you go. Fourth, we're going to talk about sound. Ideally, you have an external mic that's going to give you a lot better audio than what your camera or your phone can do on its own. But if you can't do that, just be careful where you record. You want to avoid a lot of noisy surroundings, and you want to avoid being in an echoey room. If you're doing a voiceover at home, something that you might do is create a pillow fort or record in a closet full of clothes, and that's going to help you avoid unwanted sound and unwanted echo. The last tip is to plan your video. Make an outline, make a storyboard. Just make sure you do something so that when you film, you already know what you're going to do. It's going to make your life a lot easier while you're filming and then while you're editing, and it's going to go a long way toward making a good video. Now let's talk about our characters. We want to have someone that we can root for or against. They're going to be the focal point of our story. We love a good hero and a good villain, but what makes a good hero and a good villain? A good hero is going to be someone who can save the day. They're likable, they're courageous. Whatever it is, something that your audience is going to key in on and they're going to want them to succeed. You might be thinking of the Marvel movies where you have a literal superhero who is literally going to save the world and potentially the universe, depending on which movie you're watching. But we can also look at things like rom-coms. If we look at something like She's All That and To All the Boys I've Loved Before, those are examples of a hero who isn't saving the world, but it's a character that you're wanting to win, someone you're wanting to root for, someone you're wanting to succeed. A villain, though, is often best understood in contrast to the hero. They're the ones that are trying to ruin the world. They're the ones that are trying to keep the hero from succeeding. And sometimes you might have a hero that you're actually kind of fond of, like Loki from the Thor movies. But basically, you want to make sure you have a good villain because How do you have a good hero without a good villain? The Harry Potter movies are a good example of the flexibility of what villains can be. Voldemort is the big bad villain throughout the series, but Umbridge is actually the one that most people often hate the most. You probably don't know someone trying to take over the world, but at some point you've met someone who is a bully and abusive of the power they have in their position. So that's something that you understand. So that's something you want to keep in mind is oftentimes your villain might be something very small, but it's something that's very relatable. Something we want to keep in mind is that your heroes and villains do not always have to be people. Now, there are always kind of the animated and fantasy worlds where the animals and trees can talk, but even if we just look at our real world around us, the animals, the plants, and even the planet can be portrayed as heroes depending on how you want to tell the story. So go watch a nature documentary, and you can very easily see a lion portrayed as a hero or a villain depending on what story they're trying to tell. Basically, don't box yourself in. You can be open-minded about who your heroes and who your villains are going to be in your story. Now that you have your characters, you want to look at them and see what's going to resonate with your audience, what's going to stand out. I remember writing a news story about a math professor when I was in college, and the thing is, math professors aren't that exciting. But this one rode a motorcycle, and that is something that becomes a bit more interesting than just having a story about a math professor. Everyone has something that's interesting about them, something that the world doesn't know. Your job as a storyteller is to find that and then bring it to life. Next, we're going to talk about the actual journey, the story, the arc, the structure, basically the path that your characters are going to go on. There are a lot of ways to do this, but I'm going to focus on two basic examples. One is to do an intro, body, and conclusion. Now, there's nothing exciting about the intro, body, conclusion format, but there's a reason that that's the way you learn to write papers. It works. So intro, you're going to introduce them to the story, give them an idea of where you're going. Body, you're going to tell the story. Conclusion, you're going to wrap things up. Another common option is the hero's journey. And so this is something you'll see in a lot of action adventure movies. So like the Marvel movies, The Hobbit, Star Wars, but like those rom-coms that I mentioned earlier, like She's All That and It's All the Boys I've Loved Before, things like that, those are also going to follow that general arc of the hero's journey. So it starts with your hero getting a call to adventure, something that's upending their normal life. Oftentimes, they're going to have a mentor, they're going to have friends, people who are going to help them through their adventure. So as they're trying to overcome their challenges, eventually these stories typically have an abyss, where something bad happens. Maybe the mentor dies, maybe the worst thing that they could imagine happens. Basically, they hit their lowest low. By hitting rock bottom, that gives them a chance, though, to go through transformation and atonement to save the day. And then they can return back to their life, whatever that new normal is going to be now that they've gone through the hero's journey. Now, not all stories that use the hero's journey are going to go through identical steps, but they're going to all go through the same basic path. Okay, we found our characters, we found our journey, but how do we actually tell the story? The first and biggest piece of advice I can give is to know the medium and genre that you're going to be operating in. TikTok is different than YouTube, which is different than TV, which is different than movies. They all have their own norms, their own styles, and you need to understand where your video is going to end up so that you can film the best video that you can. TikTok is meant to be brief, so that's going to affect the type of stories you can tell. But it also is meant to be shot vertically instead of in landscape mode because it's meant to be viewed on a phone. So that's going to affect not just what story you're telling, but literally how you're going to film it. YouTube is going to be a bit longer and it's going to be filmed in landscape like TV and movies, but you're still going to want to keep it relatively short. So think about 2 to 3 minutes because your audience, unless they're already really interested in the topic, they're not wanting to watch a 10, 20, 30, 40-minute video. Every outlet has things that do and don't work, so make sure you take a look at a bunch of examples so you can figure out what kind of world you're operating in as you're trying to tell the best story that you can. And when we talk about genre, we're typically talking about style. So are we talking about a slapstick comedy? Are we talking about an energetic action movie? Or are we trying to tell a more serene story? So oftentimes genre means comedy, drama, horror, things like that, but it can also refer to something else. With YouTube, for example, you have vlogger style videos that are full of jump cuts. You can have unboxing videos where you literally watch someone open a package and tell you about the things that are inside the package. And you can also have reaction videos, videos of someone else watching a video. Part we're going to address. So now as I'm going back and rewatching this footage of the video that I was working on, I'm realizing that I plugged in the mic incorrectly, so now I need to redo all of my audio portions. There are a lot of ways to do this, but I'm going to focus on 2. And that makes me very sad. So no matter the story that you're trying to tell, you want to make sure you understand the norms of the genre so that you can mimic them the best as possible. And then if you want to break the rules, you're breaking them intentionally instead of just doing it on accident. And as for actually filming the telling of someone's story, here are some quick options that you might want to consider. One is to do interviews. You can interview the person, have them tell their own story, or you can interview others and have them tell the story on that person's behalf. And so in that case, you literally have someone telling you the story. Ideally, you're going to have B-roll that's going to cover the footage as they're talking. And so that's going to be footage of something else, but you're still going to hear the person talking. And that B-roll typically is going to be more interesting than just having a video of someone talking to a camera. Another option is the vlogger style video, which is basically just an interview, but instead of covering with B-roll, you're going to have a whole bunch of jump cuts in the video. And if you really want to understand your character's perspective, a point of view shot goes a long way to helping your audience see exactly what your character should be seeing. And of course, there is the traditional third-person shot where you film your character in action. And you can use those third-person shots to cover up your interview for your B-roll. Now let's make a long story short with some closing advice. 1, make sure you have a plan. This is going to go a long way to improving your video and making your life a lot easier as you try to tell the story. 2, practice. Practice, practice, practice. If you want to make a good video, you're going to have to make a lot of bad videos first. 3, look for help. There are a lot of free resources out there online through Adobe, through YouTubers, and other online communities of people who are creating videos, and they love to share what they have found. And so don't be afraid to look for help. You don't have to do this all on your own. Okay, that's it for this video. I hope to see you at the Zoom workshop.